The first presentation here is from Kristian Bjørnstad. I see he is here with us, and the title of his presentation is Bridging Parks, UNESCO Areas and Tourism Through Heritage Interpretation. And I'm going to pass straight over to you, Kristian, to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Peter, and thank you, thank you, everyone. Very glad to be here today. Great conference, great themes, great presenters. I'd like to welcome you up north for a little while, together with my colleague Trym and I. We're going to talk a little bit about the connection between parks and interpretation. We're going to talk a little bit about the new types of parks that are emerging in Europe and the potential for interpretation in those parks. And we're also going to speak about how interpretation can strengthen connections with tourism and also between various parks and institutions. We have some fresh experiences from our association. It's the Norwegian Parks Association. We are the regional parks of Europe, but we do collaborate with UNESCO-areas, national parks, and other types of areas. And we are really committed to heritage interpretation and through courses, plans, and networks. So I'd like to share my presentation with you. I hope everything will work out. And can you see it? I hope.
Yes, that's fine. Yep.
Great. That's perfect. Yeah, like I said, we are developing heritage interpretation in our association, in our parks up north, and we have some good results. Although we've been slowed down by the COVID situation. Which meant that we couldn't run any courses or anything else. So that was a setback. But this fall we are running full steam ahead, and very happy to do that. I just wanted to talk a little bit about interpretation in the north, especially specifically Norway. And I would actually like to go further back. I would actually claim that we have quite deep roots for interpretation in the north. Actually, we have pathfinders that we can find from in the indigenous people, the Sami people, that helped interpret the spiritual world, and they were early interpreters, I would say. And also the Northern Lights, for example, they were interpreted by the people up north. We also have a sign, an Old Norse sign for Pathfinder, which is at the bottom left side there. So we do have some good roots of interpretation, although of course we haven't called it that way. But today we are working with interpretation. But you might be surprised to know that we are actually far ahead, far behind actually, compared to other European countries. In Norway, this is a very fragmented field. You have the museum educators, you have environmental educators, you have different types of subject fields, and they don't really communicate. So we see there's a great variation within this, a variation in practice. We also see that there's a lack of interpretation plans. There is no real good funding for guides. We have very good private companies that are guiding people in nature, but the government in Norway has until now put a lot of money into architecture. Like you see here, architecture in nature is a big thing here. We spent millions, or if not billions, on this, and it's basically architects that have sort of designed interpretation through consciously or unconsciously. So that's a bit of a situation here, and that's why we in our association are very interested in connecting to the European and the international field of heritage interpretation as it is practiced and developed internationally. Well, there's a close connection to the US national parks and parks in general and interpretation. So now I'm taking the international view here. We who have worked with interpretation for a while know that Tilden is Freeman Tilden is an important figure. He came out of the U.S. national parks, and of course it's a very important contribution in modern interpretation. But I also think that it's quite interesting to, when we talk about the roots of interpretation in the parks, we should also acknowledge the colonization and the indigenous people of in the early development of these parks. I think we should emphasize that more, and I see that our colleagues in the United States and Canada are very focused on this at the moment. So I think really that's something we should, as European interpreters and park people, we should also concern ourselves with. Just an example, the first European national park was established in Sweden in Sami areas, so in the indigenous people's areas. So I do think we should acknowledge that. But the field grew in heritage interpretation, and today I would say that the parks, the various parks, are important in bringing the field forward. And what's interesting, you all might know the national parks, but there are also other diverse park models appearing and developing in Europe, and it has been for the last 20 years. And I'm speaking about the regional parks, the geoparks, the UNESCO biosphere areas. So there's a diversity of parks and UNESCO areas in Europe at the moment. And I think that's quite interesting, because the national parks have been focused mainly on nature interpretation. But these new types of parks are also focused on cultural heritage, and landscape that connect nature and culture. So I think that a broad heritage approach to interpretation is actually more important in these areas. And I also think that these types of parks and UNESCO areas could really develop interpretation even more, and that's the role of Interpret Europe, I think, in connecting more with these areas. Basically to create connections, first-hand experiences, and also to tell the sustainability stories that we need to tell. And that's quite an interesting development. I'd like to show you the parks that we are part of, the regional nature and landscape parks of Europe. They're also part of the new dynamic parks, although they are not new. They really developed after the Second World War in Europe, in France, in Britain, in Germany. But there are 900 parks of this type in Europe, and we also belong to that type of parks. This is our association. We have 9 regional parks across Norway. We also collaborate with the 47 national parks that we have here, the 3 soon to be 5 UNESCO geoparks, and also the first UNESCO biosphere area in Norway. So we actually have taken a lead in developing interpretation, because there's actually been a kind of in Norway, in the national parks, it's sort of it's been sort of the ideal of that you should find your own way in nature. We sort of have this this ideal in Norway. You should explore for yourself. You don't really need a guide. So, and that has been a problem really for developing the field, because people don't really see the reason for guides and also for good interpretation until recently. Now the mass of tourism before COVID are increasing, so we do see a great need for interpretation in our parks and UNESCO areas. And parks in itself, and I saw Carol Ritchie was on yesterday and spoke about parks as destinations in themselves, and also the Europark Federation is working closely with sustainable tourism and developing sustainable tourism in the parks. As you see, there's very much so far has been developed in central southern Europe. We are slowly getting there in northern Europe as well. We have our own tourism project that we are connecting to the European Charter model, Parks Norway. And of course, in that project, we try to connect also our work with interpretation. Yes, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the case of one of our parks, the Nærøy Fjord World Heritage Park. It's a combined regional park and World Heritage area. And as you can see, there are, if you wake up in this little village in the fjord, you wake up to cruise ships looking at you. And then you can start asking the question, how are the connections between locals and tourism in this area? When you have 1 million tourists go by looking at you when you have your breakfast outside. At the same time, you have big international companies that make a lot of money on basically viewing your farms and fields and fjords. So we had a challenge in this park where we tried to connect locals with the living World Heritage, and also to connect the visitors more with local people, local villages. We had the tendency that we saw these villages were overrun by cruise tourists. There were several buses. There could be like 6-7 buses at the time in these villages. So the park really had to do something. So they set up a very good visitor management project, and they focused heavily on interpretation. So today they are setting up very good panels together with the villages. They run workshops all the time so that you get the local perspective, and they are now also working more actively with guides that they also call fjord rangers. And just a couple of weeks ago, we had a course there in the World Heritage Park. We had the CIG course, the Certified Interpretive Guide course, and it was a great success. And these are people who work in the parks, and we hope that they in turns will contribute and develop interpretation with their partners, park partners and other companies. We also have other courses planned, the Certified Interpretive Planner course and the Certified Interpretive Writer course, and also the 2-day modules for park partners, basically, in the different parks. So we're rolling this out now. Luckily, the COVID situation has improved in Norway, at least. So we're happy about that. So we can go back to running courses and developing the field further. So we've also started a network because we think that heritage interpretation is important for others as well, not only the parks. So we developed the Interpret Norway network. We focused on institutions in the beginning. Perhaps we will open for personal membership also, but we also encourage both the institutions and people to join Interpret Europe. We have about 50 institutions now. We have regular meetings, and also we invite them for courses. In our network, we have geoparks, World Heritage Sites, we have architects, regional authorities, regional museum organizations, visitor centers, and many more. You might wonder about one of the pictures there. How do you interpret that? I will leave that to all of you to ponder. It's a special feature, geological feature. I will not mention the name here. Yes, so just to wrap up my short presentation here, I've been just connecting some of the dots between parks in general and the field of interpretation, and also I looked at the connection between it, and it's still close. What I mentioned was that these new dynamic parks, so-called dynamic parks and UNESCO areas, I think they hold a great potential for future development of heritage interpretation, because in those parks and UNESCO areas, there's a much more focus on bridging nature and culture, or people and nature. And I also think that that's something that we should focus more on. And I'm looking forward to the discussions and presentations tomorrow also in how do we as parks and interpreters tell sustainability stories? How do we connect what we do to sustainability and the challenges we face ahead? Interpretation is also a key component of visitor management. And the example of the World Heritage Park is one example. It is important strategy for visitor management. You could of course close areas off, but if you're smart about interpretation, you could also reach other goals, I think. And it's good for facilitating more meaning making in tourism experiences. It's for creating good experiences and also good connections between locals and tourism. Yes. And also lastly, when it comes to the network that we have started, we see that there's many different subject fields that they basically call education or interpretation. But I think that the international field of heritage interpretation, it can bridge different subject areas so that it can create a common language, if you will. And we see that already, that people have taken up, interpretation and the language much more now. So we sort of have a common platform in our Interpret Norway network. And I think that's a great development, and it will be interesting to see maybe in a year or two how this will develop here up north. Yes, that would be it. Trym will also comment in the chat if there are any questions. And that was my presentation, Peter. So I'll stop sharing my presentation here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. The host for these sessions is Diana Nola. She's having difficulty with connecting, so I will continue with this. We don't have very many comments yet, but all of you are very welcome to have comments or questions in the chat. I would like to just make an observation that you mentioned the UNESCO. They're not designations, are they? There is a particular term. It's like a certification for a place. But the biosphere reserves are very much bottom up community-based rather than top-down of a national park. And I'm wondering if that makes a difference to the whole approach of management, but particularly the approach to interpretation of the place.
Oh yeah, very, very much so. And that's one of the typical features of this type of park, the regional parks, the UNESCO biosphere reserves, UNESCO geoparks. It's basically bottom up. And that's how our parks developed also. They developed bottom up in various regions in Norway. And also I would have to add that in the Nordic countries, we do have a very good we have much trust on the local level. We have strong municipalities. So there is a very much a bottom up, almost in anything, any policy area, any development, there's a good bottom up process. But when it comes to interpretation, I would say that at least in planning, we need to focus a lot on good processes with communities. Yeah. So it's basically community interpretation, basically. Yeah.
Yes, because often we focus just on the product, don't we? And yes, we've got some good things that we can provide here, but the process in identifying who could be involved in the interpretation, who might offer their stories to share, and the whole process of creating a plan and interpretation, that is just so important, isn't it?
It's very, very important. If you want people to work with you, then that's very important. But I also see that, for example, in the fjord park in the fjord, is that they are mobilized already. They see how tourism affects their own areas, so they come together and they see like there must be another way. How can we control this? How can we steer tourism? And signs, of course, it comes up right away. How do we put up a sign? And that's where I think it's important that you have trained staff in both process leadership, but also in interpretation, so that we don't only focus on the product, but we take a step back and say, okay, what do we want to communicate? What do you want to communicate? How do we want visitors to move in our areas? How do we want to make money on them? Do we want to steer them to a local cafe? Do we, Yeah. So it's sort of an integrated, sort of holistic approach, and that's where I think interpretation is very much part of that.
Yes, and then it becomes very much then the connection between interpretation and the sustainability or the sustainable approach to tourism, and sometimes you've got to be really careful about how you do that.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, of course, there are other areas in other parks that we have that have very little tourism. So that's where you have to use it in another way. You have to find good stories to tell so that you can attract tourism. And that's where you have to work with the tourism industry and the destination companies. Do they tell the right stories about our areas?
Yeah.
Not always.
No. We have a question here from Per Sonvik. What are the biggest challenges for development of heritage interpretation in Norway?
I would say that there are so many groups and different organizations that think they are doing the right thing, that they are excluding everyone else. I mean, it's hard sometimes to find a common ground because you have very sectorized subject matters, the museum educators, the environmental educators. So to break the sort of borders between those, I think is perhaps the largest challenge. And that's why I think if we refer to the international practice and the field of interpretation, it's much easier to look out to Europe and be perhaps unite under that instead of trying to convince the other group that our approach is better.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was a question about your interpretive guide training, and it's kind of been answered. It's about who certifies, and it is Interpret Europe, of course. But you took on that training program very specifically for your staff. Do you see that as extending further into others, staff, maybe communities, maybe whatever?
In the short term, we're focusing on staff because we see that they have some basic skills, and they are also have some training before. They're used to working with groups. Because the CIG course is a very demanding course. It's a great course, but it's demanding, so it's not perhaps for everyone. What we see is that the 2-day module that Interpret Europe has developed, that is more related to the partners.
Yeah.
So we are going to try to test it out in the new year. We're testing out the 2-day modules for tour operators, communities within the parks. So we try to, we focus on staff when it comes to the 5-day courses, and of course there might be some park partners that are well trained and would like to join, and that's fine. But I think the 2-day course would be great to reach a larger number, and ideally the different parks would then train and be trainers, and then train and use the 2-day course in their parks. So
yes.
Yeah.
Which is what the ethic of this training program is all about, of course, is pass it on to others. A final question here is from, I believe, somebody in Finland. I may be wrong. What is the Norwegian word for interpretation?
Interpretation.
Oh, very close. It's a difficult word in some languages.
Yes, it is, and I see that there's different variations that we have in our different languages, but it's based on the same root. So, and also it's a new. We have to spend a lot of time trying to explain what it is, but once people start to taste it, they kind of like it. So.
Yeah. Right. Okay. A few other comments there, but I think we've kind of run out of time. Can I thank you, Kristian, and your colleague there, Trym, as well, for your presentation. Very interesting, and all good information about what is happening there in Norway.